My stepfather once looked me straight in the eye and said, "Keisha, you need to be realistic about your place in this world. Black women got to work twice as hard just to get half as much, and honestly, baby, I don't think you got that kind of fight in you." I was 22, fresh out of what he thought was community college, sitting in their living room wearing clothes that didn't quite fit right. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he was preparing me for the real world. My mama nodded along, her new wedding ring catching the light as she cleared my spot at the dinner table to make room for his business awards. "It ain't your fault, baby girl," she added softly. "The world's just different for us. You'll find something that works." They meant well. At least that's what I keep telling myself. But that conversation became the background music to every family function for the next 15 years. Every holiday, every birthday, every time I walked through that door, I could hear it in how they introduced me to their friends. "This is Keisha, my daughter from before. She's still, trying to figure it out." While my stepbrother Terrell was getting promoted to senior partner at his accounting firm, they threw celebration dinners. When my stepsister Ayana finished pharmacy school, they rented out the church fellowship hall. When I came home from what they thought were random dead-end jobs, they asked if I needed help with my bills and changed the subject real quick. The truth was, I couldn't tell them where I'd really been. Couldn't explain that I hadn't dropped out of college. I'd been recruited straight from my engineering program into Naval Intelligence. Couldn't mention that while they thought I was working at the mall or serving tables, I was actually designing classified defense systems in facilities most people don't even know exist. For 15 years, I let them believe I was the family disappointment. It was easier than trying to explain why I couldn't talk about my work, why I travelled so much, why I never seemed to have a normal job with normal hours and normal co-workers they could meet. My name is Keisha Johnson, and I'm about to tell you the story of the day my family discovered that their biggest failure was actually the highest-ranking black woman officer any of them had ever met. But before I share what happened that changed everything, I need to know you're here with me. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, or just type listening if this story is hitting home for you. It means everything to have someone witness this truth. And if my story helps you feel less alone in dealing with family who don't see your worth, please hit that subscribe button. It helps other people find these stories when they need them most. Now let me tell you about the day everything changed. I grew up in what looked like the perfect blended family if you saw us at church on Sunday. My mama, Denise, had remarried when I was 8 to Calvin Wright, a successful insurance broker who came with 2 kids of his own. Terrell was 10, Ayana was 6, and suddenly I wasn't an only child anymore. I was the middle kid in a family that ran on respectability and keeping up appearances. The Wright house was all cream leather furniture and family photos arranged just perfect. Calvin had strong opinions about success, about how black folks had to present themselves, about what he called making something of yourself in this world. His kids seemed to soak up his ambition like sponges. Terrell was class president and in all the honor clubs. Ayana was already talking about being a doctor when she was still losing baby teeth. And then there was me, a quiet kid who liked taking things apart more than talking about grades, who spent hours messing with old computers and radios just to see how they worked. I was good at math and science, real good, but I didn't perform my intelligence the way the right kids did. I solved problems in my head instead of showing off. I read advanced physics books for fun, but got regular grades because the simple stuff they taught in school bored me to tears. Keisha marches to her own beat, my mama would say, which in Wright family language meant we don't know what to do with this child. When I was a senior in high school, everything changed. I'd been accepted to several good schools for engineering, but I'd also been quietly recruited by something I couldn't talk about. A black woman in a navy blue suit had shown up at my physics teacher's classroom one day asking to speak with me. She'd seen some work I'd submitted to a national science competition, work involving radar technology and signal processing that I'd developed just because it seemed like an interesting puzzle. 3 meetings later, I was signing papers I couldn't explain to my family. The cover story was simple. I was starting at the community college to explore my options. Meanwhile, I was actually beginning a classified track that would eventually lead me into Naval Intelligence, specializing in underwater defense systems and submarine technology. For my family, this was proof of what they'd always worried about. I wasn't driven like Terrell, who was heading to Morehouse for business, or focused like Ayana, who already knew she wanted to be a pharmacist. I was just lost. Calvin shook his head when I told them my plans. "Community college," he said, the disappointment heavy in his voice. "Keisha, with your test scores, baby girl, you could have gone to Spelman, Howard, anywhere. I don't understand why you settling for less when black folks can't afford to settle." My mama tried to be supportive, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Maybe after a year or two, you'll transfer somewhere better," she said hopefully. "You still got time to make something of yourself." I nodded and smiled and let them believe what they needed to believe. It was the first of many lies I'd have to tell to keep my real life secret. The next 15 years were like living two completely different lives. To my family, I was the underachiever who couldn't seem to hold down steady work. I'd disappear for months at a time, saying I was doing contract work or temporary positions. When I came back, I'd be vague about where I'd been, what I'd done, why I always seemed to have money despite never talking about a real career. Keisha's between opportunities again became my mama's go-to explanation when church folks asked about me. What they didn't know was that I was rising through Naval Intelligence faster than most people thought possible. My work on submarine detection systems was being used across the entire Pacific Fleet. I'd spent 2 years with a team developing countermeasures for underwater nuclear threats. I'd briefed admirals and defense contractors, and once spent 3 weeks in a facility so classified that I didn't see sunlight for almost a month. But I couldn't tell them any of that. My security clearance meant complete separation between my work life and personal life. My family knew me as Keisha Johnson, the drifter. The Navy knew me as Lieutenant Johnson, then Lieutenant Commander Johnson, then Commander Johnson, and finally, 3 years ago, Rear Admiral Johnson. The irony hit me every single day. While my family worried I wasn't ambitious enough, I was literally helping shape naval strategy for half the world. While Calvin lectured me about black excellence and making our people proud, I was briefing senators and cabinet members about national security. Family gatherings became exercises in creative storytelling. When Terrell made senior partner and they threw him a big party, I sat with the kids because the adult table was for people with real accomplishments. When Ayana opened her own pharmacy, Calvin gave a speech about perseverance and dedication, looking right at me during the parts about not giving up on your dreams. I smiled and clapped and stepped outside to take work calls that were actually briefings with Pentagon officials. The breaking point came last month. Ayana was getting married, a big church wedding that Calvin had been planning like a military operation for 6 months. As the maid of honor, my stepsister had very specific ideas about how everything should look, and apparently those ideas didn't include having the family disappointment too visible in the photos. "I hope you understand," Ayana said, pulling me aside during the rehearsal, "but I asked Terrell to walk you down the aisle instead of Cousin Jerome. It looks better, you know? Since Terrell's got his business success and you're just, just me. In a bridesmaid dress that cost more than some people's car payments, watching everyone else get introduced with their job titles while I was just Keisha, the bride's stepsister." That night, I sat in my old bedroom, the same room I'd had since I was 8, still with the same furniture, because why invest in permanent stuff for someone who was just figuring things out, and made a decision I probably shouldn't have made. I pulled out my phone and called my aide, Lieutenant Commander Brooks. "Admiral, everything all right?" "I need a favor, Brooks. A personal one." "Of course, ma'am. What do you need?" "I'm at a family wedding tomorrow. There's going to be a military colour guard because the groom served in the Army Reserves. I need you to coordinate with them. Make sure they know who I am." There was a pause. Brooks knew about my family situation. When you work as closely as we did, some personal details become unavoidable. "You want them to acknowledge your rank, Admiral?" "I want them to follow proper military protocol," I said carefully. Whatever that requires. Understood, ma'am. I'll handle it. I hung up and stared at the ceiling with the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd put up when I was 12. Tomorrow, my family was going to learn something about me that I'd been hiding for 15 years. I wasn't sure if I was ready for what would happen next, but I was tired of being invisible in my own life. The wedding was everything Ayana had dreamed of. Elegant, expensive, and perfectly coordinated. The ceremony was at Mount Olive Baptist Church with about 300 guests filling every pew. I stood at the altar in my purple bridesmaid dress, holding Ayana's bouquet during the vows, smiling for the photographer when he pointed my way. During the reception at the community centre, I found myself at the same table I always ended up at during family events, the extended family table, with my great-aunt who asked the same questions about my job every time, and my cousin's wife who spent most of dinner showing everyone pictures of her kids on her phone. Terrell, looking sharp in his Army Reserve dress uniform, was seated at the head table with Calvin and my mama, telling stories about his weekend training exercises to anyone who would listen. He'd been in the reserves for 5 years, never deployed, mostly doing recruiting events and community service projects. But he wore that uniform like he'd personally liberated a country, and Calvin couldn't have been more proud. "My son, the officer," Calvin kept telling everyone, "serves his country while building his business. That's what I call black excellence, success with service." I picked at my chicken and tried not to roll my eyes. The colour guard arrived during dinner, 4 active-duty soldiers in dress blues who would be presenting the colours during the reception's formal ceremonies. Ayana had arranged for them to honour her new husband's service, and Terrell was going to join them for a special recognition moment. What my family didn't know was that Lieutenant Commander Brooks had spent the morning on the phone with the colour guard's commanding sergeant, explaining exactly who would be in attendance at this wedding. The moment came during the formal programme. The colour guard had presented the flag, Terrell had been recognised for his reserve service, and the lead sergeant was getting ready to dismiss when he stopped, scanning the room. His eyes found me at my table in the back. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clear across that community centre. "I apologise for interrupting, but I've just been informed that we have a distinguished guest here tonight who we haven't properly recognised." The room went quiet. Ayana looked confused. Terrell straightened up, probably thinking they'd forgotten some part of his service record. The sergeant's eyes stayed locked on mine. "Rear Admiral Keisha Johnson, would you please stand?" The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on that linoleum floor. Every head in that community centre turned toward my table in the corner. My great-aunt's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My cousin's wife nearly dropped her phone. At the head table, my mama's face went pale. Calvin's mouth fell open. Terrell looked like someone had slapped him. I stood slowly, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. The colour guard snapped to attention and gave me the sharpest salute I'd ever seen outside of an official ceremony. "Admiral," the sergeant said, his voice steady and respectful. "It is an honour to serve under your leadership, ma'am." I returned the salute, years of training taking over when my brain seemed to have stopped working. "The honour is mine, Sergeant. Thank you for your service." "Ma'am, if I may," he continued, "I served aboard the USS Hampton during the implementation of your submarine detection protocol. That system has saved countless lives, Admiral. The entire fleet is grateful for your innovation." The room stayed frozen. Someone's chair squeaked. Ice clinked in a cup somewhere. But nobody spoke, nobody moved, nobody seemed to be breathing. Ayana's face had gone from confusion to something close to panic. This was her perfect wedding, her carefully planned day, and suddenly her underachieving stepsister was the centre of attention in a way that made her new husband's reserve service look like playing soldier. Terrell was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. The uniform that had made him the military representative at this wedding suddenly looked like dress-up clothes next to the recognition being given to the woman in the purple dress. But it was Calvin's face that surprised me most. He wasn't angry or confused. He looked shocked, like a man trying to put together a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit what he thought the picture was supposed to be. The sergeant concluded the recognition. The colour guard filed out, and slowly, like someone had pressed play again, the reception continued around us. But everything had changed. Conversations buzzed with confusion and questions. I could feel eyes on me from every corner of the room. I sat back down, my hands shaking as I reached for my water. My great-aunt leaned over and whispered, "Baby, what just happened?" Before I could answer, my mama appeared beside my chair, her face still pale and her eyes wide. "Keisha," she said quietly, "we need to talk." I looked up at her, this woman who had raised me, who had worried about my future for 15 years, who had spent countless conversations wondering where she'd gone wrong with her directionless daughter. "Yes, Mom," I said simply. "I think we do." The conversation didn't happen at the wedding. Ayana was barely keeping it together as it was, and Calvin seemed to be in shock. My mama kept staring at me like I was a stranger, and Terrell had disappeared. I found out later he'd gone outside to call his reserve unit to ask if what just happened was even real. Instead, we talked the next morning, in the Wright family kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast as a child, where I'd done homework at that same table, where I'd sat through countless lectures about applying myself and making something of my life. Calvin sat across from me at the table where he'd once told me I didn't have enough fight in me. My mama stood by the coffee pot, turning her mug around and around in her hands. Terrell was there too, still looking confused, still processing what he'd witnessed. "Rear Admiral," Calvin said, testing the words like they were in a foreign language. "Keisha, you're a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy." "Yes, sir." "How long?" 3 years at this rank, 15 years total in Naval Intelligence." My mama set down her coffee with shaking hands. 15 years. Baby girl, you've been lying to us for 15 years. "I've been protecting classified information for 15 years, I corrected gently. "There's a difference." "But we thought—" Terrell started, then stopped, shaking his head. "We thought you were working retail, restaurant jobs, temp work. You let us think you were—" "A disappointment," I finished. "Yes, I did." The words sat there between us like something you could touch. Calvin flinched when I said it, and I could see him remembering all the times he'd used that word, or words like it, to describe my choices. "Why?" my mama asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Baby, why would you let us believe that?" I took a sip of coffee, the same coffee I'd been drinking in this kitchen since I was 8, and tried to find words for something I'd never had to explain. "Because my security clearance required it," I said. "Because the work I do is classified at levels that most civilians will never know exist. Because it was easier than constantly making up stories about specific details, so I let y'all think what you wanted to think about the big picture." "But Keisha," my mama said, tears starting in her eyes, "we worried about you. All these years we worried about you. We thought you were lost, that you couldn't find your direction, that we'd somehow failed you." The hurt in that hit me hard. They'd worried they'd failed me while treating me like I was their failure. "I know," I said quietly. "I'm sorry for that part. I never wanted y'all to worry." Calvin was staring at his hands, his usual confidence completely gone. "Keisha," he said without looking up, "I owe you more than just an apology. I said things. I believed things about you that were wrong, dead wrong. You believed what I let you believe." "No." He looked up at me then, and I was surprised to see shame in his eyes. "I chose to believe the worst. I chose to see failure instead of asking questions. I chose to think you were giving up instead of considering that maybe you were doing something I couldn't understand. And worse than that," he paused, his voice getting rough, "I used every stereotype about black women struggling to make sense of what I was seeing, instead of thinking that maybe my stepdaughter was out here breaking barriers I couldn't even imagine." Terrell cleared his throat. "That colour guard," he said. "They knew you. That sergeant talked about your work like you're somebody important. In the military, are you somebody important?" I almost smiled at that. I'm not famous, Terrell, but my work has impact. The systems I've designed are used throughout the Navy. The strategies I've helped create influence policy at the highest levels. I've briefed Congress and the Joint Chiefs and foreign allies. Lord have mercy, he breathed. And I've been going around talking about my weekend drills like I was some kind of military expert. Your service matters too, I said, and I meant it. Reserve duty is important. Community work matters. You don't have to make your contributions smaller to make mine bigger. My mama sat down at the table then, looking older than I'd ever seen her. Keisha, honey, I need to understand something. All those times you came home and we asked about your job, about your life, about your future. Were we just a joke to you? Did you think we were fools? That question hurt worse than any accusation could have. I reached across the table and took her hand. Mama, no. Never. Y'all were never a joke to me. This family was never something I laughed at. Do you know how many nights I laid in submarine bunkers or classified facilities, homesick and tired, wishing I could tell you about my day, wishing I could share my successes with the people who raised me? She squeezed my hand, tears flowing now. But you won awards, didn't you? Promotions? Big moments in your career, and we weren't there. We didn't even know to be proud of you. You weren't there because I couldn't have you there. But I carried you all with me anyway. Every briefing, every mission, every time I had to make a decision that could affect thousands of people, I thought about the values you taught me in this kitchen. Service, protecting people, doing what's right, even when it's hard. You think you failed me, but everything good about my career came from what y'all taught me growing up. Calvin stood up suddenly and walked to the window, his back to us. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. 22 years old, he said. You were 22 when I told you that black women had to work twice as hard and you didn't have that fight in you. 22, and you were already commanding classified operations that most people couldn't even dream of. Calvin, my mama started. No, Denise. Let me say this. He turned around, and I was shocked to see tears in his eyes. Keisha, I spent 15 years thinking I was trying to motivate you, trying to prepare you for how hard the world was going to be for a black woman. But really, I was being cruel to someone who was already succeeding beyond what I could imagine. You've been out here protecting our country, leading people, making decisions that shape history, and I was lecturing you about black excellence while you were literally living it at the highest levels. The kitchen got quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and cars passing outside. We sat there, 4 people trying to figure out how to rebuild relationships that had been built on misunderstandings. Finally, Terrell spoke up. So what happens now? He asked. Do we just pretend the last 15 years didn't happen? I looked around the table at these people who had raised me, worried about me, misunderstood me, and loved me the only way they knew how. We start over, I said. We start from the truth and see what we can build from here. My mama nodded, wiping her eyes with a dish towel that had been hanging in the same spot since I was little. I'd like that. But Keisha, you got to help us understand. We don't know how to be proud of something we can't see, can't talk about, can't even brag about to the church folks. You don't have to understand all the details, I said. You just have to trust that the work matters, that what I sacrifice has purpose, and that the woman doing it learned how to serve others from the family that raised her. Calvin sat back down, looking exhausted but somehow lighter. Can you tell us anything? He asked. Anything at all about what you do? I thought about classification levels, about security protocols, about the line between sharing and compromising national security. I can tell you that I design systems that keep sailors safe underwater, I said carefully. I can tell you that I've helped develop technology that prevents wars instead of just fighting them. I can tell you that when I brief the people who make decisions about our national security, they listen to what I have to say. And you're good at it, my mama said. It wasn't a question. I'm very good at it. She smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from her since the wedding. Of course you are. You were always brilliant even when we were too worried to see it right. Over the next few hours, we talked more honestly than we had in years, not about classified details or military secrets, but about the strange, separate lives we'd all been living. They told me about the worry, the confusion, the conversations they'd had about me when I wasn't around. I told them about the loneliness, the isolation, the cost of keeping such a big part of my life secret from the people I loved most. It wasn't perfect. 15 years of misunderstanding don't disappear in one morning. But it was a beginning. As I was getting ready to leave that afternoon, Calvin stopped me at the door. "Keisha," he said, "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but would you be okay with me telling people the truth? Not the classified parts, just that my stepdaughter is a rear admiral, that I helped raise someone who serves at the highest levels of our military." I looked at this man who had spent so many years thinking I was his biggest disappointment, who was now asking permission to make me his proudest accomplishment. "You can tell people whatever you want, Calvin, but tell them because you're proud of who I am, not just what I've achieved." He nodded, his eyes bright with tears. "I am proud of who you are, Keisha. I should have been saying that all along." 3 months later, I'm sitting in my office at the Pentagon, looking at a photo that came in yesterday's mail. It's from Terrell's promotion ceremony. He'd been selected for captain in the reserves, recognition for his leadership in their community programs. But this photo is different from all the others that used to line their mantle. I'm in it. Right there in the center, in my dress uniform, standing next to my mama who's glowing with pride. On the back, Calvin had written, "Admiral Keisha Johnson and family, finally got the picture right." My aide, Lieutenant Commander Brooks, knocked on my doorframe. "Admiral, the Joint Chiefs briefing starts in 10 minutes. "Thank you, Brooks. I'll be right there." As I gathered my folders and prepared to brief the nation's top military leadership on submarine defense strategy, I thought about that conversation in the kitchen 3 months ago, about truth and family and the strange ways we hide from the people we love most. My mama calls now every Sunday. She still doesn't understand what I do, but she understands that it matters. Calvin brags about me to anyone who'll listen, carefully sticking to the details I've told him he can share. Terrell asks me questions about leadership and service that go way beyond his weekend duties. And Ayana. Well, Ayana still hasn't quite forgiven me for stealing her wedding thunder, but even she's started introducing me differently at family gatherings. This is my stepsister Keisha. She's an admiral. Not Keisha who's still figuring it out. Not Keisha who's between jobs. Just Keisha. She's an admiral. It took 15 years, but my family finally sees me. Not the version they wanted me to be, not the failure they thought I was, but the person I actually am. A black woman who learned about service and strength and excellence in their kitchen, and who's spent her career proving that black women don't just belong at the highest levels, we excel there. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who see us through the lens of their own fears and limitations. But that doesn't mean the love isn't real, or that the truth can't eventually break through. It just means that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show the people who raised you exactly who you grew up to be. The briefing went well, by the way. The Joint Chiefs approved my new defensive recommendations, and 2 of them stopped afterward to thank me for the leadership and innovation I bring to our national security. As I walked back to my office, I thought about calling my mama to tell her about the meeting. Not the classified parts, of course, but just that I'd had a good day at work, that my ideas were valued, that the woman she'd raised was making a difference. Then I remembered. I don't have to think about calling her anymore. I can just call her, because now she knows that when Admiral Johnson has a good day at the Pentagon, it means her daughter Keisha had a good day too. And after 15 years of living 2 separate lives, that connection feels like the greatest success of my career. If this story touched you, if you've ever felt underestimated by your own family, or had your potential dismissed because of who you are, let me know in the comments. Your story matters, and if you want to hear more stories about claiming your respect and showing the world what black excellence really looks like, hit that subscribe button. We all need reminding that our worth isn't defined by other people's ability to see it, especially when we're out here breaking barriers they didn't even know existed.